Good morning or evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to this SciDev-Net Readers Conference call on the impacts of the war in Ukraine on global food security. I'm Ruth Douglas, Deputy Editor for News at SciDev.net. So we launched these events earlier this year to give our readers the opportunity to meet with our regional editors from around the world once a month, and also to bring in some of the scientists and other experts that we're fortunate to have among our connections here at SciDev, in order to discuss the issues of the day in science and international development. So today I'm very happy to welcome our four guests: Aladdin Hamwieh, who is Egypt Country Manager for the International Centre for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas; Friederike Greb, an economist with the World Food Programme; and Fermin D, Adriano, undersecretary for the Department of Agriculture of the Philippines. My apologies, it's actually three. We were expecting four, but we've got three excellent guests with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have with us our managing editor, Ben Dayton, and our regional editors for Sub-Saharan Africa French and English editions, MENA edition, Asia Pacific edition, and Latin America edition. Perhaps if any of you have something to add at some point, you can introduce yourselves then. So in a moment, I'll start by putting some questions to our guests to start our discussion for the first half of this call. And then I'll move on to taking questions from the audience, which you're welcome to drop into the Q&A box at any time. Perhaps it's worth saying that we do acknowledge the more immediate and devastating impacts of this conflict for people on the ground and the 2.8 million refugees who have fled Ukraine. And we know that this situation incites strong feelings, but we would just ask everyone to keep questions broadly within the remit of the topic that we're discussing today. Friederike Greb, if I may start with you, perhaps you could give something of a global overview. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization has warned that the world is facing a potential food crisis as the war in Ukraine threatens supplies of key staple crops. And we hear a lot about the impact of wheat exports from Ukraine. Is this the main commodity affected by this crisis, or are there others of significance when we talk about global food security? And how reliant is the world on Ukraine and indeed Russia for these commodities?
So, of course, this conflict has immediate repercussions for food security through the humanitarian emergency that it creates in Ukraine, but there's also a whole other perspective to take because of the role of both Russia and Ukraine in global grain and energy markets. And through that, we have a huge collateral damage on food security of this conflict. And you mentioned already wheat. So Russia and Ukraine combined, they account for about 30% of global wheat exports. And the same for maize, it's almost 20%. Ukraine exports a lot of sunflower oil and barley as well. But of course, wheat is like one of the main staple commodities. And currently, while a lot of exports have already happened for the current marketing year, there's still almost 14 million tons of wheat and 16 million tons of maize basically frozen in Russia and Ukraine. Because Ukraine, the ports are closed, but then also the Russian supplies, they also cannot really get out of the country, because if the vessels that would transport them from the Black Sea to wherever they need to go would be hit, they are at risk of being hit by missiles. So insurance companies have put huge war risk premia if they're willing to provide coverage at all. So basically, trade has come to a halt, and these millions of tons of grains are frozen in those countries. And that was very visible immediately when you look at global grain prices. So, for example, the wheat price index, the International Grains Council's wheat price index, which is a combination of major export quotations for wheat, it was up by 28% within just 2 weeks. If you look at the Monday before the conflict and then 2 weeks into the conflict. Now they have recovered a little bit, but within that time period, we've really seen huge price spikes. For example, the US wheat, soft red winter wheat went up by more than 50%. So it has clearly had a tremendous impact, has caused turmoil on global wheat markets. crisis. And that, of course, then first and foremost hits countries that were expecting shipments of grain from Russia and Ukraine. And there, especially one of the areas of concern is, of course, the Middle East, because, for example, Lebanon imports more than 50% of its wheat from Ukraine. For Yemen, it's 22%. In Tunisia, it's 42%. But not only those who buy directly from Russia and Ukraine are affected, but because of these then global rises in global prices, every country who imports will pay higher prices. So that's one, and that, of course, then, of course, if I go to baker, or if I buy bread, I don't pay the global wheat price, but it then has to trickle down to local consumer markets to actually have an effect on food security in poor countries. But that happens then first or is expected to happen first in import-dependent countries, and that's when you get this food security effect, when people lose access to food because the price of the food that they buy in their local markets goes up. So that's one channel where we are very concerned about. But then there's also the fact that Russia is a huge player in global energy markets, and we've seen oil prices reach a 14-year high in the past weeks. I mean, now they have gone down a bit. But that's, of course, for energy import-dependent countries, a huge concern, because even if the food arrives in the country, if fuel is prohibitively expensive, then that will affect food costs. And again, you have an effect on the local population who will then not be able to afford food anymore. And also, you basically need everything, energy for everything. So to produce anything, so that can also contribute to a rise in inflation in general, which again makes the cost of living more expensive. And yeah, so I should also say that, of course, in poor countries, or if you look at the most vulnerable, they spend a huge share of their income on food. I think the average is the 63% figure that FAO calculated as a benchmark. So that really gives you an impression of what these, even if it's a small increase in the local price, it can really have an effect on the affordability of food for the poorest. And then the energy market issue goes beyond those inflation effects, because energy, or gas especially, is an important input for fertilizer production. So if gas prices skyrocket, then fertilizer becomes extremely expensive. And that means that maybe farmers won't be able to use as much fertilizer for the next harvest going ahead. And there you have then a longer term impact on food security through probably elevated prices in the longer term, because you just have smaller supplies. And adding to this problem, Russia is also a huge player in the fertilizer market. So it's one of the biggest exporters of three of the main groups of the major groups of fertilizers. So those are the channels through which we see this crisis impact food security all around the world. And to make matters worse, at the same time, also those who try to assist food insecure people face higher costs. So, for example, at the World Food Programme, we expect our own procurement costs for food commodities, and then also for fuel, to go up by 29 million a month. If the price, I mean, that's at current price levels. So it's of course a very fluid situation. As I said, the oil price reached almost $130 per barrel, and now it's back to about 100. So it's estimates, but it's huge price increases, and those come on top of all the price increases that we've already seen over the past year and a half or so, which already increased WFP's costs by an average of 42 million a month.
And of course, the world is already on the cusp of in a global food crisis due to COVID, climate change, and so on. So how will the global South, in particular, low middle income countries, cope with these challenges?
Yeah, no, as you said, it's already, I mean, I've now only talked about the conflict's impact, but really it comes at a point where the world is really not in need of another crisis, because so food prices have been on the rise. The FAO food price index actually reached a new all-time high in February. Of course, that also includes then a bit of the Ukraine effect, but they were already skyrocketing. And on top of that, we've had COVID, and it's not like the world has recovered from COVID. I mean, the economic recovery globally was disrupted by new variants, by supply chain issues. Then we've had rising inflation, there's record debt, and that's at a global level. But then if you look at poorer countries, there's really been also a divergent recovery, that the poorest are those that have recovered the slowest, because they have had less access to vaccines, because they have not had the financial capacities to put in place huge economic stimulus measures, and also they have a huge debt burden that has now increased even further. So when you look at 2015, there were already 30% of low-income countries that were in debt distress or at high risk thereof, and now it's 60%. And that, of course, constrains. I mean, that's money that you then don't, if you pay a lot in debt servicing, that's money that you don't have to put in place social protection programs for your population. And yeah, I mean, inflation, I mentioned the food price index that was high, but if you look at local food price inflation in February, we saw, I think, 27 countries that had inflation levels more than 15% a year. And that's a lot. And some of them, if you look at the likes of Lebanon, Venezuela, Sudan, Yemen, they were in the 3-digit food inflation realm. So we were not in a good place to get hit by yet another crisis.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for those insights. We'll maybe come back to you later, Friederike. Aladdin, Hamwieh, welcome. You, as I said, are Egypt country manager for the International Centre for Agricultural Research in the dry areas, based in Cairo. What immediate repercussions are you seeing in Egypt and in the wider region since the conflict began, obviously only 2 weeks ago? And what concerns do you have over the longer term?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to come to this webinar. And I don't want to repeat what Friederike said. I fully agree with her. She pointed all these really important consequences that it's coming from the crisis in Ukraine. And unfortunately, this Ukrainian crisis came after COVID, and also we face the climate change. So today, for example, it's not usual to have like this address, and we are in mid-March and still cold outside. Today morning it was like 8-9 degrees, so which is not used. In March it's really, we feel usually hot, but this year it's I mean, we touch this climate change. We have in ICARDA station in also Morocco. This year we had severe dry area, the climates there. Our crops really suffered to survive this year in Morocco. Yeah, so well, in Lebanon, and also my colleagues will travel today, and they also face problem to cross the roads because of the snow. Imagine now we are in March and it's snowing now in Lebanon. So the crisis of Ukrainian Russian came in very hard time after COVID and this the new development of climate change, and we start to touch this in our shops. 2 days ago, I went to buy a bread, and it was 25% the price increase. So this one came because of the fact that our Egypt is like others countries in the Middle East. We import wheat from outside, and Ukraine and Russia occupy the advanced place in our between the exporter to the Middle East. So now we have for example, let me give some numbers. In the Middle East, we have 60% of our grain are imported, 25% from Russia, from Russia, and 17 from, no, 25 of the 60% is coming from Russia, from Russia and Ukraine. So where 17 is from Russia and 8 from Ukraine, where the rest come from Canada, from US at 14%, and 14% from Canada, and France 10%. Now the question, after we found how we found the countries banning this, exporting products from Russia and Ukraine. Now, can the other supplier cover the needs of Egypt for wheat? In Egypt, Egypt is one of the, maybe the first one in the world importing wheat. This is like the public food every day for Egyptian, and the needs like 22 million ton. Egypt produce like around 11-12, and still half of their needs, it's Egypt need to import. Now the immediate action also made by the government here, because they felt how the situation could be severe, dangerous. So they announced to the people on the public media that they have almost, they can cover the shops for 5 months to 6 months. So they have stock of wheat for that amount. And also they gave a new, what is called, a new regulation to the government, or ask the government to support the farmers of wheat, and give some kind of what I would say, in support, to buy more wheat from to pay to the farmers, wheat farmers in Egypt, what they can harvest. We are now, after 1 month, the harvest will start. So we need really the government try to collect as much as possible of the wheat to keep it in the stock. And hopefully the Ukrainian-Russian conflict will be ended quickly. We cannot bear long time of conflict in this important area. We don't know what the consequences, as Friederike said. The problem also not only to buy from another producer like Brazil, one of the largest agriculture producer, but let's here focus on another fact, that Brazil import 84% of their fertilizers. And when we talk fertilizers about Ukraine and Russia, we should remember that they are the major producer in the world for potassium chloride. So it's, for example, China also producing, but also import from Russia 2 million ton of potassium chloride. The consequence is really hard to count, but when I was preparing for my talk today, I read a very scary report from FAO. They tell about 8 to 13 million people will suffer from hungers around the world as a consequence of this conflict in Ukraine. That's what I can now say, answering what is going in Egypt, and also what is, what we fear for the future. Back to you.
I mean, we obviously hope that it doesn't turn into a long, drawn-out conflict, but if it does, over months or even years, how serious do you think the risks are for your region?
Now, for Egypt, for example, let me talk about Egypt took several actions now, and I think it is right. Not responding to this crisis in particular, but in general, the new government in Egypt here, I mean, the new government in the last 7-8 years, they tried to make a new reclamation for new lands to produce wheat, because they know that they should increase the area because of also high this rate of population growth in Egypt. They need really to find the new resources of area to plant. So this is happening now. They have a project, a mega project for reclamation of 1.2 0.5 acres in Egypt. They use the desert, so they use a new method of irrigation. They used even there is a development of irrigation in the Nile Valley. This is good. I think this is one we should put in our plan for the future. The second one, I wish that is happening. There is a potential of increase of production, wheat production in the area. Like Sudan, I visited 2-3 years ago, and I found that this area it has a potential to really to produce more than what it is now. I passed by, for example, farmer for chickpea, and excellent area, excellent production, but it's very poor in case of they don't have machineries, they don't have good varieties resistant to diseases, or they need more support from the global area, I think from the global organizations to improve the production. Sudan, they have water, they less than the Middle East affected by the climates, so rain and others, they use irrigated agriculture. So there is a potential, I think, of going to another area and start to establish a better system for agriculture and practices and what is called the equipments for agriculture, and also to start supporting, the fund for research. We need to improve to have like CGIAR. Imagine also that 70% of the wheat world comes from varieties developed by CGIAR, and here for wheat is CEMET and ICARDA. So we have in ICARDA, or under now CGIAR, one CGIAR, we have a lot of potentials, new resources, for from the gene bank. I mean, a lot of potential, to research to increase the productivity and to produce a more resilient crop for the different environment in the region. And by this one, I think if the government put more fund on that, and all the organizations, I think we can produce much better than what we are now, to avoid such crisis in future if anything happen in any area. So this, I think, could be the solution for the future. Yeah. So this is what I can tell. We need to.
Thank you. We'll maybe come back to you on that point later about how we can build resilience, and I'm sure our readers will have some questions for you. Let me turn to you, Dr. Adriano. Welcome. You're Undersecretary or Deputy Minister for the Department of Agriculture in the Philippines. What do you see as the potential repercussions of the Ukraine conflict for the Philippines and other developing countries in South and Southeast Asia? Is it a similar picture? And do the risks apply? Do the risks apply to all countries, or are some particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, I think I would just not talk about the Philippines, but it's typical of the developing countries in the region. But I have to point out that even there was already a World Bank report that when the COVID-19 struck, more than 35 million people in the region reverted back to below the poverty threshold. That's a huge, it's practically a country in the region because it's a very populous region. So the COVID-19 is there, and this Russian-Ukraine conflict has practically exacerbated our problem, because we already had a problem in terms of accessing food because of the logistical bottlenecks that came about as a result of the COVID-19. Nobody could work during that time in the docks. We had shortage of shipping crew and everything like that. But this one compounds the problem tremendously because of the fact that the two countries are major producers of wheat and corn. I think in the context of Asia Pacific, the demand for grains are driven by two things. One is human consumption, which is basically bread for wheat. The other one is animal consumption, which is basically the poorer version of wheat, which we call feed wheat, and of course corn. And remember that in Asia, we have been plagued by the African swine fever. China, Vietnam, Philippines are pork-eating nations. It wiped out a significant number of our hogs in the country. In China, millions of hogs were culled out because of the African swine fever. During the time of COVID, all of us were in the process of trying, including Vietnam, we're in the process of repopulating our hogs. And that's the reason why for the great demand for corn, you can see. And in fact, Vietnam even lowered their tariffs on corn just to be able to access corn. And China is doing it right now because it's trying to scoop up all the grains that it can scoop up in the world because of the repopulation, the hog repopulation program in the country. That's what we're facing right now. And the problem is exacerbated by the fact that because of the rise in the fuel prices as a result of the war, necessarily fertilizer prices will go up. In fact, in the Philippines, fertilizer prices have actually tripled, and that will have implications on the productivity of our farmers. If you don't apply we have already done calculations because in the West, bread is the staple food. In Asia Pacific, it's rice. So we did some calculations immediately. What is going to happen if they, lower the application of fertilizer? We're talking about 1 million metric tons of rice that will be lost in the process because of lower fertilizer application. And that's the reason why we are in a hurry to find organic materials to substitute for inorganic fertilizer because of the fact that Russia is a major fertilizer exporter, and it's blocking the Baltic Sea and cannot export anything to us. We're a major exporter of wheat feed, particularly animal feed from Ukraine. I think it's the number 8 producer of wheat and number 4 producer of corn in the world. So those are the sources that are actually not available now. So you can just imagine the implications of that, plus the huge, the significant increase in transport costs. Petrol prices now in the Philippines, $6 per gallon. Our minimum wage, our daily wage rate is only $10. You can just imagine the implications, the worst implications, particularly the poor of the poorest, the poorest of the poor among our people. So this Russia-Ukraine conflict really, I think, aggravated the problem of food insecurity, not only in the Philippines, but across the different countries in the region, like Indonesia, because it's a populous country, about 250 million, Laos, Cambodia, and even India for that matter. So that's the kind of future that we're facing. And we hope that there will be an immediate end to this war, to this hostility, so that prices will go down. And as Friederike Greb said, the fiscal situation has worsened tremendously. Prior to the COVID, our debt to GDP ratio is less than 40%. Now it's hovering 65%. Prior to COVID, the people that go hungry is about 6 out of 10 members of the household go hungry. Now it's 6 and increasing. So that is a real threat to our food security and to the vast region of the Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And we've talked about how this is one shock on top of another shock on top of another shock. How can your region become more resilient to these impacts?
We need to, the technology is badly needed right now. And as I was saying, that we are now exploring the possibility of organic substances like the bio end to be able to produce nitrogen that will substitute for organic nitrogen, organically based nitrogen. We're also trying to adapt to the challenge of climate change by having an early planting season, so that we can avoid we usually have destructive typhoons towards the end of the year. So if we can balance our planting season, by the time that those destructive typhoons, by the way, we were visited by about 18 to 20 very destructive typhoons. By the time that they visit the country, we were already harvested. That kind of improvisation is badly needed now. We need the use of digital technology, the drone right now, to be able to properly monitor our production, calculate our damages and losses, so that we can properly plan what needs to be imported from other countries, particularly our ASEAN neighbors, so that we can fill in the food gap if there's any.
Thank you. I wonder if any of our regional editors have anything to add at this point about what you might be seeing or hearing in your regions, about what authorities are doing to mitigate against these risks, or about what whether any of these trickle-down effects that Friederike mentioned are already being seen in terms of the effects on ordinary people, or is that more of a longer term? Are we talking about future risks at this point? Or anything else that in terms of what's being reported in your region, perhaps, on this issue? If not at this stage, I'll turn to some questions from the readers. If we have some, bear with me a minute. Or perhaps indeed, if any of our regional editors want to pose any questions to our guests.
Yeah, I'm particularly worried about the perspective shared by Friederike. I think the developed countries are in the same boat right now. High inflation, increasing food prices, and of course, they're also helping Ukraine in terms of financial and military capability. And the worrying thing is that will leave, the attention will be diverted inward or towards the conflict. And that would be, I think, that will adversely affect the assistance to developing countries. The Asia-Pacific region, I think, relatively well off. The ASEAN countries can help each other. But I'm particularly worried about Africa. I think it's a major challenge there. There's a major challenge that need to be addressed, and because of the diversion of attention inward, because of high inflation, and of course, supporting Ukraine in the resistance. So what are we going to see in the future on that? Will that? I just don't know the answer right now. No. It's a bit dire to me.
Ref, can I speak?
Yes, please do. Do you want to introduce yourself, Julien?
Yes, okay. Thank you, and hi to everybody. My name is Shongwang Julien, and I'm the regional editor for the French edition of SciDev-Net. So what we have noticed in our region is that even before the war in Ukraine started, there was already a sort of inflation of prices in our of food products on our market. And what certain countries have taken decisions since the beginning of the crisis. In Gabon, for example, there has been a very high rise of the prices of flour bags of 50 kilos. Before the war started, the bags of 50 kilos of flour, of wheat flour, was sold in Gabon at 60,000 francs CFA. And since the beginning of the war, the price of this 50 kilos wheat flour rise to 90,000. So it is a rise of almost 19%. And what the government in Gabon did was to organize a sort of meeting with all of stakeholders in order to agree that they are not going to increase the price of bread that is sold to the final consumers. So by now, they have not yet increased the price of bread, but the people are very afraid because they think that this situation risks to change if the war continues, if the war does not finish very quickly in Ukraine. It is also the case in Côte d'Ivoire, but in Côte d'Ivoire, what the government did by now to avoid an increase of the price of bread was to make a sort of subsidies of $55 million for fuel products. And since therefore now the price of the bread has not yet increased in Cote d'Ivoire. In Cameroon, there is also a lot of discussion now between the producers of bread, the importators of flour, of wheat flour, and the producer of bread, and the government. The backers want to increase the price of bread, but there are a lot of meeting between them, the importators and the government, to find a way to not increase the price of the bread. So this is a sort of a small roundup of the situation in sub-Saharan African French. And the last thing that I would like to mention is that in Senegal, Senegal import the half of its wheat from Russia, and by now there is a sort of tension, a sort of crisis between producers of bread and the government, because government told them to not increase the price of bread. So there is a lot of tension in the country. This is what I can give as a sort of situation in sub-Saharan African French. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Julian. That's really interesting. Let me pick up on a couple of questions which are linked in a way. How much of this food insecurity is due to the war in Ukraine itself, and how much is due to the resulting sanctions on Russia? And similar to that, apart from physical constraints to grain exports from Russia through the Black Sea, do we know if international sanctions impact the purchase of Russian grains? Perhaps those are questions for you, Friederike.
Okay, well, the first one on how much is due to the conflict and then differentiating that from the sanction, I find it a bit difficult because the sanctions are, of course, part of the conflict. So you cannot say this is the conflict effect and then this is the sanctions effect, at least in my mind, to my mind. And of course, a large part, I mean, if you look at all the like physical destruction consequences, that's of course completely independent of any sanctions. If your vessel gets shotted, if the Ukrainian, it's also what we haven't mentioned, or what I haven't mentioned before, is that also we have to look at all the inland infrastructure that Ukraine has for their grain production and grain export. Because if the Russian invasion hurts or damages that infrastructure, then even if Ukraine is able to produce the same amount of wheat going ahead in the next season after the conflict is over, then maybe it's very difficult to get it out of the country. So I would here much more like focus on also the physical constraints, and of course the economic sanctions on Russia. I think what the question aims at is that I said the oil price really went up, and that's because Russia is a big player in the energy market, but I would still see that as a consequence of the invasion and the conflict itself. And then on the second question, so to the best of my knowledge, and it's a very fluid situation, so what I read yesterday might not hold anymore today, but to the best of my knowledge, all the sanctions, so food and fertilizers, it's exempt from the sanctions. And it's more through well, the physical constraints, but also the whole uncertainty around the sanctions, and that creates then, like for example, for banks who finance trade, it's very risky then to finance trade from Russia if you don't know if there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future, and if you're actually going to go, and if this trade is actually going to happen. So that would be my answer to those questions.
Thank you. And this one's more on the solutions. As the world is moving from one crisis to other ones, what solution do you recommend for mitigation? The same person mentions that drought is also impacting food security. So yes, how can we make agriculture more resilient in the face of these multiple threats? Aladdin, perhaps you'd like to take that one.
I think now to face this problem, as I said, we can put more investment in developing a new supporting actually the system in the region. And let me mention the Nile Valley, because also we put actually this in a proposal that we can produce, use the marginal land for the valley to produce not wheat. We cannot produce there, but we can produce barley. So we can also mix barley with bread. This also one option to, and actually to increase the value of the value of the bread. By mixing up to 25% of the bread, it's almost produce the same quality, but even better. Between so 75% of wheat and then 25% of barley. The bread is really very fantastic. And if we think about the marginal land on the valley, we can produce a huge amount of barley. Then this can be also at least a kind of mitigation for the crisis now for food, if this will continue for a long time and the people will search what to eat. So then also try to, we need really that the decision maker in the world to try to help to avoid sanction on the fertilizer material, made avoiding also restriction on the exporter. We should also in as a society make a social safety networks. We should think about it in the countries to help, and also to produce or realigning incentives, and that's what is happening now in Egypt. I think there is many ways that we can, and on long term, again, we can do better. Following this breeding programs, we can produce much better crops. Resilient crops can grow under different environments, so we can at least secure more production in future. Dr. Fermin and also Julian, for area like in Philippines, or where I visit Philippines and I saw most of their food is coming from rice, and also in Africa, I think cassava it's a major of this major food. So I understand that this Ukrainian crisis also make problem for the fertilizers, but do we think that it is the same like the crisis or the damage which could happen in the Middle East? Because the Middle East, the major food is the bread. That bread come from wheat. Now, is it the same risk we have for food security in Africa? This is a surprise for me, because I know that rice and cassava. Can I hear from them?
Yes, I think we are in a better position because particularly ASEAN countries, because most of them are middle income countries, and they have a very highly productive agricultural sector, in particular rice, because we have poured so much resources to rice research. And in fact, the International Rice Research Institute is actually located in the Philippines. And for rice, we don't have a problem, because immediately that's the concern of any department, our ministry, because that's the staple food, just like wheat. Just like in Egypt, political administrations might fall because of this problem, shortage, and that's the reason why we immediately pounced on that, really monitored it very hard. And it was good that we had a record harvest last year, and at the same time we over imported particularly from Vietnam, which is a very good neighbor of ours, about 3 million metric tons, around 3 million metric tons of rice. So we built enough buffer stock, rice buffer stock. I think we don't have problem in terms of the staple food. We're not going to have long queues for rice, and that is a factor that will somehow mitigate any social unrest. It is actually in the protein sector that we're going to have a lot of problems because of the inadequate, rising prices of animal feed grains. and it's a major issue right now because if you look at the malnutrition level, about stunting, about 29% of our kids below 5 is stunted. And then as the kid grows to 14 to 17, the protein deficiency reaches up to 47%. So that is the problem. It's not the access, but the affordable, the issue of access to nutritious food. That is a major problem in our country. And I think we have a very good economic relationship within ASEAN, working closely. So if there's a gap, Vietnam or Thailand, these are major rice producing countries, surplus, you know that you're in Thailand. They plug it because of the good relationship. And of course, there's always India that produces a lot of grains. In fact, it's exporting a lot of wheat now in the world because of that good supply gap. And I had just a talk with the Indian ambassador, and is even willing to donate some grains to the Philippines because of the, again, neighborly relationship, good relationship among us. So I think we can weather it, but I hope it will not take too long. My God, the problem. I hope, cross our fingers. Particularly, our concern is really this link between petrol prices and fertilizer, because that will have a long-lasting impact on our economic. We're just recovering from COVID. We're now opening our economy. Our COVID cases are really down by hundreds only now. We're opening, but the thing, this one hits hard, very hard, because all of the prices are increasing because of transport costs, increasing transport costs, etc., etc. That's what we are. I think the region, even Thailand, is in the same boat because of the lack of tourists. Is a big contributor to the economy of Thailand, and so is Indonesia. Thank you. I will stop there.
So, thank you. So one of our guests, and perhaps this is what you were talking about in relation to barley, I'm not sure, but Samia asks, we did a lot of research in Egypt on implementing intercropping systems. I'm not sure where Samia works from, but where wheat was a secondary crop, which resulted in production of extra amount of wheat without using extra areas and water. Do you think this will be a partial solution to the wheat gap?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I fully agree. We have to do all what we can. Therefore, I'm talking to you from the here in Cairo with the Agricultural Research Center. Everyone try to contribute to solve this problem. I mean, from agriculture, using all the possible way to improve the production. And I fully agree that we have to use innovations for the future. We have no option either except to go in that way.
Ruth, can I just also inform the body that there's a huge supply of barley from Australia. It's a huge country with huge agricultural. And the reason for that, actually, a lot of them were diverted to the Philippines because of the sanction made by China against Australia because of its stance over the COVID investigation. So we use that as a substitute for animal feed, wheat and corn. So there's still a surplus there. So I think what we need is not just looking inside, ramping up our productivity, but we need to do better coordination with other countries, which I'm sure are generous enough to share whatever they have in these trying times, particularly to developing countries. It's just a matter of trying to tap the resources they have, which I believe they will generously share as they did to the Philippines. Thank you.
And do you think this more sort of nationalist, or securing food for one's own country is a dangerous approach? Any of you?
It is a temporary. You cannot avoid it. It takes time before you grow something. It's just like there's a gestation period for nature. You can be self-sufficient. You can declare sufficiency, but it takes time. For example, hog production, it takes about more than 7 months, 7 months before you can produce the hogs that you will slaughter. In the same fashion, it will be about 3 to 4 months before you can have your rice or wheat. And therefore, this is an immediate, it's a crisis situation wherein government intervention is warranted. It's not just market imperfection that we're talking about. There is a market failure already. And
so
that's the reason why.
What I was referring to more was where a country it decides to not export. So in order to
every country wants to become food self-sufficient because that's part of their security. But we need to balance that in terms of the economic rationality of where they're pursuing self-sufficiency is in the best interest of the country. When we have a globalized trading economy, we need to trust other countries as well as they trust us. But as an immediate measure, we cannot avoid it but import. And that's the reason why we are doing it right now. We're trying to stockpile food and, bank on the generosity of our trading. But of course, we will pay them, but bank on the generosity on sharing their harvest to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Friederike, a question for you. What are WFP's contingency plans in light of the Ukraine-Russia crisis?
Okay, well, maybe let me first, I wanted to actually reiterate the point that you made on trade restrictions, that's of course of utmost importance that trade keeps flowing. And I think also if you look back at 2008 at the crisis back then, that was one of the main issues, that countries started implementing these beggar thy neighbor policies to protect their own food. I mean, that was mainly exporting countries who then said, we're not going to export more because we want to protect our own population and keep prices at an okay level. And that's a huge problem. And one of the, since we talked about mitigation measures before, maybe to add there that after the previous price crisis, the G20 actually created what is called the Agricultural Market Information System, which is a platform for policy coordination and also to create market transparency. Because one of the issues back then was also that it was maybe not super clear how much was there in the world, like how much rice was in stock in different countries and how much countries were producing and needed and how much trade was going to happen. So that just to reiterate that it's super important to keep the trade flowing, to avoid fueling the fire or and raising prices higher. So on WFP's plan, so we are currently so of course we did an assessment of which operations could be affected, because WFP is sourcing a lot of grains from the Black Sea region, because of course it's, if you look at Yemen and Syria, it's much closer to source the wheat there than to go buy Canadian wheat. But yeah, especially for pulses now, I think the cost will also go up quite a bit because we will need to go further afield to get the supply. So we are evaluating the situation, like which countries will, or which operations will be affected, and then how we can find alternative sources. And at the same time, of course, we've started the operation in Ukraine, and the idea is it's more than 3 million people that we are supporting there, or about to support with food assistance and cash.
Does anyone have anything to add? Or
just to add on, it's not just sharing about food, because I've been attending several meetings with science ministries, and a lot of the discussion is actually also sharing on technologies, because as Aladdin earlier mentioned, there are several options that you can do, although a lot of them are quite small, but at least that could help in mitigating some of the issues surrounding food. Like, for instance, substitution. So you put in, let's say, we also had that similar one in the Philippines, replacing some of the wheat with malunggay. And so we use malunggay there's a research there, and that's already being used in some of the stores in the country. They at least can reduce the content of wheat between 5 to 20%, depending on the type of the bread that is being sold. So that's just one example. So there are several examples. And these are research that have been just a kind of sideline. Very few people, the public knows about it. And that's not just in the Philippines. There are also, even in Japan, there are this kind of research on say, we call it ube, which is purple yam. And the DOST here just found out that they have an improved variety. And so they're kind of looking at that, trying to figure out which country can probably share their own technologies with some of the countries based on the cooperation among these ministries or departments. And so it's beyond trade. It goes the same with science ministries here.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our guests for your time and for giving some really interesting insights on this subject, which is, as you say, Friederike, a very fluid situation. So thank you for being willing to join and discuss what you know. And as I say, these readers' conference calls are a monthly event. So please do join us again next month, and we'll be in touch with details of what our next call will be about and how to join. Thank you again to all our readers and to our guests today.